Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs, the creator and producer of this author series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of American history, learning more about President Dwight Eisenhower, cross-continental travel, and our country's car culture. On your screen is a schedule for our 75-minute event. Shortly, our featured author, Brian C. Black, will join us for approximately 35 minutes as he discusses and shares images from his new book, Ike's Road Trip: How Eisenhower's 1919 Convoy Paved the Way for the Roads We Travel. After Professor Black's solo time, moderator Ted Widmore will join us for further discussion. In the last 15 minutes, Dr. Widmore will pose your questions. We got a few good ones in advance, and we'd be happy to hear from you with additional questions. You can enter those at any time into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's program is being produced and recorded by my colleagues in the Brew Family Learning Center. The video will be sent to all registered attendees in the next 24 hours, made especially for participants who had technical difficulty or who could not attend live. A large percent of you are zooming in from a different time zone, and we welcome you. As good as tonight might be, or the video, of course, the real education comes from reading Professor Black's recent book, Ike's Road Trip. For those of you who ordered a signed book bundled with your virtual event ticket, your copies will be sent in the weeks ahead. If you have not yet ordered a signed book and you find that you want one, or you'd like to add additional signed copies to your order, you can purchase those directly from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Please order using the link being shared in the chat. The bookstore can send your copies anywhere in the United States for yourself or as a gift. Moving on to our formal introductions this evening. Brian C. Black is Distinguished Professor of History and Environmental Studies at Penn State Altoona, where he currently serves as Head of Arts and Humanities. Recognized as a global expert on petroleum history, his research emphasis is on the landscape and environmental history of North America, particularly in relation to the application and use of energy and technology. Professor Black is the author of several books, including To Have and to Have Not, Energy in World History, Crude Reality, and the award-winning book Petrolia. His work has appeared in USA Today, the New York Times, and the Journal of American History. Professor Black is the editor of the Energy and Society book series. He divides his time between central Pennsylvania and Cape Cod. Now, for our moderator, Ted Widmore is an historian and presidential speechwriter whose essays on American history have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and many other publications. He has taught or directed research centers at Harvard, Brown, the City University of New York, and Washington College. In 2022, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. Dr. Widmore's most recent book, Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington, won the Lincoln Forum Book Prize. His book, Young America, The Flowering of Democracy in New York City, was awarded the Washington Irving Prize. He co-authored Listening In, The Secret White House Recordings of John F. Kennedy with Caroline Kennedy. And coming up in October 2025, a book he edited will be published, Wings, The Story of a Band on the Run by Paul McCartney. We'll hear from Dr. Widmore in the second half of our program, but for now, welcome to you, Professor Black. I am particularly delighted to be presenting your book, tonight's program, in this very week, as yesterday was the 126th anniversary of Ike's Convoy taking off from Washington, D.C. Their 1919 62-day journey started, as you and I discussed in the green room, on July 7. So welcome to you, Brian, in this anniversary week, and to all of you in the audience. Let's start right in. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And yeah, we didn't know that anniversary when we scheduled this, did we? But you were very prescient about that. And Thank you to you. Thank you to Kathleen behind the scenes and American Inspirations for this opportunity to talk with everyone. Welcome. It's lovely to have you here. And we look forward to having your questions and observations. You're going to find that I think this is a fascinating story. And I had a specific way of focusing my approach to it, and it could be talked about in lots of different ways. So your questions certainly can draw from my book, but if you would like to know more about this event itself, I can try to answer those questions as well. And thank you to Ted for joining us later. As you will note when you read in the book, I am very dedicated to him for this project. He has been a gadfly for it from the beginning. And I think that's a very good lesson for all of us, that the people around us might be able to discern um, what's a good story that we take for granted a little bit. Because that's what this situation was with Ike's road trip. And for the next half hour or so, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book. And so I'll be showing you some slides. We'll go entirely to PowerPoint, and I'll let you see the pictures that are also able to be seen in the book. I'm going to be reading from the book at some points, and one of the reasons I do that in my talks about this is because I think, like all of us probably here tonight, I'm very committed to the importance of the written book, of the printed book, and I was really excited to publish this book with Godine, a publisher that's really committed to hardcover books and independent booksellers. And so I will read from the book. I'll tell you which page I'm on, just in case some of you have a copy of it. And then if you have specific questions you want to draw from specific pages, feel free to put that in the chat for Margaret to see. As Margaret mentioned, we have an anniversary. On the morning of July 7th, 1919, a 28-year-old lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, Dwight D. Eisenhower, we knew him as Ike, set out on a volunteer cross-country road trip to evaluate the emerging system of roadways in the U.S. The convoy's findings were instrumental in charting the priorities that the U.S. would follow over the 20th century. In particular, new sources of power provided a logic for expansion and development that was reminiscent of pioneer wagon trains of a previous generation. Ike later wrote, "The old convoy had started me thinking about good two-lane highways. This was one of the things that I felt deeply about, and I made a personal and absolute decision to see that the nation would benefit by it." In his ensuing experience as a U.S. military leader and president, Ike personalized and personified the American drive to drive, particularly when he oversaw the historic Interstate Highway Act of 1956. I wrote this book for the same reason that I have taught my students, particularly in history classes, about the convoy for 2 decades, for the symbol of larger change that it represents. In my efforts as a scholar to understand American energy transitions, the convoy proves pivotal. Transitions can be seen to derive from a number of different factors, including supply and technological innovation, but they require cultural acceptance and participation to achieve species-altering changes to our existence. That has been the driving force for me behind this project. I furiously study our current transition, as in the one now in 2025, and over the last few years became intrigued with looking at previous shifts for guidance in understanding our present one. As my research focused most on the early 20th century shift to fossil fuels from animal power, another point of fascination occurred to me. If energy transitions are at least partly cultural, I thought, could a historian offer our current one assistance by assuring readers that such alterations to human use of energy have occurred before and are quite natural? Could historic story bolster energy users to not fear our current transition? But similar to any worthwhile quest, the winding road of researching, making narrative connections, and finally writing left me with profound additional insights well beyond my original intrigue. These lessons of coming of age, making one's self useful to society, and perceiving the larger patterns that surround each one of us as we live our life proved profound to me personally, and I hope to readers of Ike's Road Trip as well. I'll be referring to pages 9 and 10, reading from the beginning. When David and Ida Eisenhower moved their growing family to Abilene, Kansas in 1898, the town seemed a million miles from a swiftly modernizing world. The cowtown's oddly broad main thoroughfare, edged in wood planks, had been made for driving herds of cattle to the rail yard. Beyond undulating prairie swells bathed every direction in piercing greens, the grassy plains formed a protective cocoon around those growing up there at the time, making life seem less like a moment on the cusp of the 20th century and more like an earlier era. Quote, I have found out later that we were very poor, end quote, recalled Dwight, the third of David and Ida's 7 sons. Quote, but we didn't know it at the time, end quote. Now I'll just pause here for a second in the reading. This story is about families. It's about individuals. It's about decisions. And most specifically, what I found that surprised me when I set out to tell a story about the convoy was that it's about personal choices. And in this case, we have, like many, a young man growing up in the Midwest, Dwight David Eisenhower. Growing up in Kansas, a family that's trying to figure out how to make a living, especially early in his life. Choices. I'll keep reading now from page 9. Dwight's observation grew from the incredible similarity of the people living around him. With even a modest bit of personal capital, residents of Abilene could introduce their fellow residents to new enterprises and then operate them largely free of competition. With a little grit, success begot success. The Eisenhowers arrived in America in 1741 as Eisenhower, Germans for iron hewer, having led thriving agriculture efforts in Germany. They continued farming in Pennsylvania, eventually pushing westward to Kansas. David and Ida lived for a short time in Denison, Texas, where Dwight was born. Before joining David's father, Jacob Eisenhower, in Abilene, Jacob owned a successful 160-acre farm with a large house that doubled as the Sunday meeting place for the area's Mennonite-like river brethren. On his property, he raised a windmill, and a large Dutch barn for his dairy herd, reminiscent of barns he had known in Pennsylvania. This is the life that Dwight grew up in. And what became particularly fascinating is that when he had choices to make, he looked around him and he felt strongly that those choices should lead him into the military. As I write, part of the idea of his attraction to the military was simply like many of my students at Penn State, maybe many of us, a free education, a free opportunity to go to school. On page 12 and 13, the Eisenhower family's religious ardor began each day with a Bible reading by David. He and Ida ultimately left the River Brethren for the International Bible Students Association, a precursor to the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Eisenhower boys, numbering 6 now, one having died in infancy, largely tolerated religion but looked for their way out of it. Mother, Dwight later recalled, quote, was by far the greatest personal influence in our lives, end quote. Dwight's youth was spent in successful, if unspectacular, study and hard labor at Bell Springs Creamery. He spent 2 years, first as an ice puller, shifting 300-pound slabs of ice and freezer, then in the freezer, then time as a fireman stoking the plant's furnaces before being promoted to night superintendent. Little Ike, as the family called him then, played baseball and football. Dwight discovered a future in the military largely by chance when in 1910 he renewed a friendship with Everett Swede Hazlett, son of an Abilene physician. Swede had left town to attend prep school in Wisconsin, but returned while he prepared to retake the entrance examination for the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. Swede told Dwight about the free education available through the Navy and Army academies and how he believed they offered the best ticket out of their sleepy hometown. Dwight later recalled, quote, it was not difficult to persuade me that this was a good move, end quote. He took up his project writing to his senator to gain an appointment to either Annapolis or West Point. His letter ended humbly, quote, if you find it possible to appoint me to one of these schools, your kindness will certainly be appreciated by me, end quote. Already beyond the cutoff age for Annapolis, Dwight faked his application. On January 13th, 1911, at the age of 20, Dwight D. Eisenhower passed the West Point entrance exam. However, a path that appears simple often turns out to be anything but. What happened next for Dwight was that he was assigned to specifically look at one of the emerging technologies of the era. In this era, we have a growing militarization that will result in World War I. Again, he happened to have enlisted prior to that point. And so it is Dwight who will wind up being in charge of this device known as the tank. This moves on to the battlefields of World War I. And most importantly for our story, the training that would take place was Dwight's responsibility. This is when he will be assigned to Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and he will be personally involved and responsible for the first tank training in the world, as these devices will be used on the battlefields of Europe for the first time during World War I. When you read his accounts, his greatest dilemma, I don't think that's overstating it, was actually that he did not get to serve in the war. Working at Camp Colt, he trained the soldiers that would be sent abroad to use the tanks in the first fighting that integrated them. But it was what happened after the war that becomes most important. I'll pause there just for a second because one of the things that was particularly, I'm not sure where the questions will go exactly when we begin to have a Q&A, but this, what I'm describing to you right now, was very clearly the biggest surprise to me. I'm a graduate of Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. I knew Eisenhower was deeply associated with the college, with the town. He has a farm there that is now a national landmark. Um, but I've also written a book about the Gettysburg battlefield, and it was one of the more surprising discoveries I had in writing that book that the battlefield from the 1860s had been used for the training of soldiers and tanks in particular to be used in World War One. I always knew that Eisenhower was involved. I didn't know that he was in charge, and until I was writing this book. And then what this project really was a series of connections happening. Because as he happens to become the soldier who is most knowledgeable about tanks in the United States and how to use them, even though he's terribly disappointed that he didn't get to serve in the war itself overseas. Um, when the war ends in 1919, he hears of a project, a national project to lead these devices that have emerged in World War One across the country. It is called the Transcontinental Convoy. It is basically intended to be a demonstration of new technological wonders that were used on the battlefield in Europe in particular. Beginning in Washington at Zero Milestone at the Ellipse, there's still a monument there to it if you can get there to take a look. This convoy of devices, most of which had never been seen by Americans before, it sets out on its route of discovery to show the devices to members of the country, but also to demonstrate a basic flaw in the American society. Many industrialists, many business people have discovered that if we are to leave animal power behind and begin moving about our landscape using mechanical devices of any sort, we are going to need to really get to work as a society. We are going to need to create a system of roads that will allow this expansion to take place. So these investors were able to work with the military to create a demonstration parade, I guess I would call it, a convoy that would lead these devices across the nation and in each community have a celebration of victory in World War One, as well as a celebration of what the nation would do moving forward. But what it becomes, in essence, is a demonstration of the work that needs to be done. These devices moving across the country are primarily powered by the internal combustion engine using petroleum that has emerged in a surplus amount, meaning more than we could ever imagine before. And therefore, it has become the desire. Again, I'll let this come out in the questions as so I can wrap up in just a few minutes here. But the internal combustion engine itself was being demonstrated to show that this had the transportation promise that could link the nation and each of our lives into a new way of living in the 20th century, 1919. Most importantly, and what most readers get attracted to immediately, is that yes, a lot of these devices were by our standards quite ordinary: cars, trucks, motorcycles, but some of them, like the Militar, were devices from that looked almost alien, from a different world and a different way of living. The Militar was the great hero of the convoy as we go through the record of exactly what happened over the next few months as the convoy leads its way across the country. I'll put that, well, I think I have the map coming up, but I'll just show you the map again. This map is also important to keep in mind because, again, I mentioned that boosters were very much involved in this project, in enlisting the military to take its devices and create this demonstration. Boosters typically were coming from the automobile industry, whether it be from tire manufacturers like the Firestones or from actual vehicle manufacturers, but it could also be road design because we are talking about an entire new way of approaching society. And the roads, essentially, in that trip across the country, what was really being shown was that the roads were totally inadequate for this future. So all of this was very fascinating and interesting, and we can talk more about it in the questions in just a moment. But there did happen to be this one soldier along. At the time, he was accomplished. He came along because there was a tank involved in the convoy, and he was in charge basically of monitoring it and getting it ready for demonstrations in each community. The tank was his specialty. But at that time, Eisenhower is an officer, and but this is what allows this little story to become even more magnificent because he will be just like most observers, but with different opportunities, almost like Forrest Gump, I tell my students. He will have the opportunity to really make a difference, to go through this experience of the convoy, and not just to be impressed, not just to say, gosh, we crossed the country, because they did. They will make it all the way to San Francisco. And that is an incredible accomplishment. In the midst of it, and this I'm sure is something I can talk a little bit more about with some of your questions, but there is the basic fact that again they were demonstrating how poor the roads were. So this trip was horrible. Every device got stuck over and over again. And it was the Militar that could pull them out of the ditch because there were, over most of the West in particular, there simply were no roads yet. So they were basically showing each community, you need to be ready for tax dollars to build our infrastructure for a new era, an era in which our vehicles, which might be much like these and powered by petroleum, will be treated differently. They will be situated on roads. They will have way stations and opportunities to take breaks, as we know, as automobile culture takes shape. Now, particularly for our American Inspirations Group. I think it's really important. A lot of the audiences I talk to about this project want to know about the devices, the old stuff, the old cars, and there's lots of details about that, and I can answer some questions about that. But there were also people, and each of these lives was really impacted by this opportunity that ultimately will end in San Francisco. In each community, they are treated to parades like this one. And ultimately, what becomes particularly fascinating is that Eisenhower's not just any other military person. Eisenhower will go on to have much more to do with American society, with the world, and specifically with the automobile. Today, as we discern the unique high energy existence that defined American life during the ensuing decades, the 1919 Convoy expands in importance. Understanding our current energy transition from fossil fuels is helped by discerning transitions of the past. Often, events that we already know, such as World War I and the convoy that followed it, emerge with new importance when specifically studied for their role in our changing ideas of energy. Transitions can be seen to derive from a number of different factors. I'll bring that up in a minute. Different factors, including supply and technological innovation, but they require cultural acceptance and participation to achieve species-altering changes to our existence. Informed by our new knowledge about climate change, scientists and historians have begun to call our current geological epoch the Anthropocene, an era when the action of one species, the human, has come to have an impact on the entire Earth. Historians' effort to define the era of the Anthropocene make World War I and even the old convoy stand out as a transformational moment in shaping the domestic economy of the American century. At their foundation, though, the infrastructural priorities that guided this era in the US and derived from Ike's road trip assumed a limitless supply of crude and cleared a right-of-way for a transformative high-energy existence. Even prior to July 7th, 1919, Eisenhower read the patterns and trends and forecasted that the American future would be built around cheap crude. The oil discovered in Texas and elsewhere allowed his generation to dream a future unfettered by the constraints of energy supplies. Today, the patterns feeding our energy transition are more nuanced, including limited supplies that require political, military, and strategic considerations, and clear knowledge that burning fossil fuels gravely impacts Earth's environment. And it is challenging for such a transition to occur organically because vested interests work the levers of governments to resist a market-driven transition, such as the sputtering one that was leading us from the internal combustion engine to electric-powered vehicles. One of the lessons of the 1919 convoy is to demonstrate that energy transitions have occurred in history, and that often they were directed by choices that grew organically from accepted knowledge and new technology. The final lesson of Ike's road trip then is to ask, where is our generation's path for the 21st century? How will we find it? How do we ensure that it can break through the marketplace? And which visionary leader will guide us as Ike did after July 7th, 1919? I'm going to stop there and I will invite my colleague, Ted, to join me.
Brian, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. You and I have been on this topic for a long time. You really, not me so much, but we emailed in 2019. You wrote a piece for the New York Times for the 100th anniversary of the year 1919. It was a huge success, and I guess I should begin by just asking, where did the idea come from? It's always so interesting to ask a writer. I'm sure you were thinking about it for years ahead of time, but how did it happen?
Well, I'm glad you're the one asking me that question because, it came from you. And and I'm going to make one adjustment here. Let me make sure. So, there we go. That should work better now. Um, this story is one that, as an environmental historian, I've told many times in lectures and into different audiences to talk about energy consumption,
Yeah,
especially to try to understand transitions and how they occur. Um, it was your prodding for the New York Times piece that made me think about how to pull this out, because you specifically had asked about the year 1919. Uh, and so that was something I could work up quite easily because it was something I lectured from. And then it's all your fault because at that moment, and this is what I encourage all of us to learn from, Ted was just an interested guy and just said, "Wow, that would make a great book." And and then I
it's
didn't want to do that, and for lots of different reasons. And as you
well,
may or
I
may not recall, Ted, I totally dropped the ball and was doing other projects, other books, and then COVID came, and there was a little bit more flexibility of schedule, and I went back to think about, wow, this and the way we're using energy right now, this could be set up to be kind of a moment of instruction for
yeah.
all of us.
Well,
And so that was the germ. That's where it began. And then, as I'm sure you know well from your own work, once you begin seeing how to shape a narrative, how to have it take form, things make a different kind of sense. History
yeah,
looks different. And so someone like Eisenhower that we thought we knew, and he's been well known to be the highway guy as president. That's what we talk about with him. Um, that's what he chose to make his name with. But I never really thought, how did he get originally inspired to build roads? And so some of it's just timing. So when I talk, I've talked to a couple graduations actually about this project because I think there's a lesson for young people because of where Eisenhower was in life, where he just looked around him and kind of picked what was going, what was happening, and really focused on Forrest Gump, like just a series of
yeah,
events. And so certainly he has greatness. He associated with greatness, and his emergence as a military leader is throughout World War II. Um, but he didn't want to be a politician, and he kind of backed into it. And so when he was encouraged to run for president, he looked around him for inspiration, kind of like, what could I do that's important? And and because of his experience on the 1919 convoy, it was roads and it was
yeah,
building a nation of roads. Now, there's lots of other interesting connections that I make in the book and that can be made because in the Cold War, which he was president for a portion of, um, atomic concerns and nuclear attack was thought of in a way that we can't really imagine today. And so that dovetailed with the idea of the interstate highway system, and the idea that his proposal was one that people would be able to support, even though it would be immensely expensive. And of course, that sets up the nation's history for the 20th century then. as we see our commitment to moving things with an infrastructure of highways and the convoys first, but then if we connect the dots through Eisenhower's experience, he also spent a lot of time in World War II on the Autobahn, Germany's great modernist technology, I guess you could call it, that was truly revolutionary. The United States was working on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, was working on a couple other road systems, but the Autobahn was different from everything else, and there's all different problematic motives behind why Hitler wanted to build that. But by the time Eisenhower was interacting with it, he just saw the great value to a society of good roads, and that is, I think, very telling and revealing. So thank you. I think I answered your question and a lot more, but please feel free to drop another one.
And thank you for your kind words. I think I had formed an intellectual crush on you, Brian, because I had been working on another road trip. Abraham Lincoln is elected president. He lives in Springfield, Illinois, very far, almost 2,000 miles from Washington. He's got to get on a train in February 1861, get to Washington to be, even before all the problems of being president, he's got to get to Washington. And it was a real ordeal to get there. And I wrote a book about that ordeal. And as I was studying closely everything going on in 1859, 60, 61, I realized this really big thing happened that no one ever talks about, which is the discovery of petroleum, oil in northwest Pennsylvania, excuse me. And it changed our lives forever. And you're a historian who is on that beat. And you've just been really great at telling all of us what oil means. And every time we press on an accelerator in a car, we are in a way indebted to that moment in 1859 when oil is discovered in, we think of Texas as where, but it was Pennsylvania. And you've been so strong on that topic.
Oh, thank you. And I appreciate you making the connections. Um, Boy, that's what I would say I am known for, being a historian of oil, and that would be my specialty area, that and energy in general. Um, and so one of the things that was really exciting about this project, and really when you originally teased me about it, what really engaged with me was narrative history. It was the idea of not just telling a big chronological specific story, but getting into people, getting into the
Yeah.
individual experiences, because that's one of the beauties of Ike's road trip. Yes, everything you said about petroleum is exactly right, and it is context to this larger story, but it is we would not have that moment of pushing the accelerator of the euphoria of being able to drive everywhere without all these different connections. And yes,
Yeah.
it had to be discovered 1859, and Edwin Drake sinks the first well, and it is by today's standards a pitiful experience. And so Pennsylvania's oil boom is revolutionary because we've never done anything like that before. But in terms of the amount of oil produced, it was very little, and a lot of the wells were what were called pumpers, and so they had to be pumped out with derricks, meaning they didn't gush. And so when we think about Ike's road trip in the context of 1919, what has transpired in some ways is even more fascinating than the Pennsylvania oil fields, because there was oil going on all over the world, and I don't mean to diminish that. But in the United States, the Texas discovery, particularly at Spindletop in 1901, was gargantuan in the amount of oil being produced. And of course, if we cross the layers of history, we know that at that time, we are changing our infrastructure. For instance, up till that point, from the Pennsylvania oil fields forward, Pennsylvania crude was used as an illuminant, was used in lamps to make oil, to make light as kerosene. And so when in 1901, when Spindletop comes in, we have, of course, Thomas Edison's successful experiments with electricity and electric lighting going on in many urban areas. And so that transition is going on as well. And suddenly, this flood of oil in Texas, because they are gushers, they're hugely producing wells, and we don't need it in that same way. And and so I think, particularly in some other projects, but it's part of Ike's road trip too. This first decade, I become fascinated with the 20th century because it could have gone lots of different ways in terms of what energy we were going to use, how we were going to power that accelerator we were pushing. I think, one of the things I talk about a little bit in this is kind of the prehistory to the EV life that we're having now, the electric vehicle life, because I always show my students the documentary film called "Who Killed the Electric Car." And that was around 1990, I think, that was telling the story of GM's experience. But the electric car was killed in the first decade of the 20th century. And it was, if you were going to bet, and you might recall, I had the picture of Eisenhower in his family's electric car, which was a 1914 Rochenlang, one of the first electric vehicles for consumer purchase. Um, when I when you look at the first decade of the 20th century, if you were betting, you would have bet on electric powered vehicles being what Americans used in the 20th century. And yet, it is World War I in particular, the experience of the tank, as well as a lot of other devices that proved to be pivotal in our energy transition, making this decade and the next one, the second decade of the 20th century, leading up to 1919, pivotal in the type of energy society, humans would use in the 20th century. And so all of that is wrapped in this same road trip convoy experience if we unpack it correctly. And that's what I've tried to do in Ike's road trip.
Could it have turned, I mean, this is actually a question from a listener. Could it have turned out a different way? Are there scenarios EVs could have been created in huge numbers and supported by the government? Or was that just not ever realistic? And was it always going to be fossil fuels?
I think it was really realistic. And I've been fascinated to see, particularly from like 1898 through 1910, how advanced the planning and design of many urban charging communities had gotten, where they even had deduced what electric vehicles were best for, meaning especially for trucking. Imagine a 20th century if all of our stuff that we were going to buy at the store moved to its site through a system of electric powered trucks. In many urban areas, this was the way it was happening before World War I. They were using a fleet of particularly New York is a good example, but Boston as well, using fleets of uh, these electric trucks, and they had design plans for the city that showed what radius of service area they could get to with the charge that was available. Batteries were the big problem, the big challenge, the technology that would make that work. But if you were looking at the technological challenges at that moment, they were much more significant for the internal combustion engine. And I always stress that word, combustion, because people, for good reason, had great fear of combustion going on in their vehicle with them in it. Because to start that engine in an internal combustion engine car powered by petroleum, you had to have an explosion. And they were not controlled explosions at the beginning, and people got hurt. And you needed to have your own mechanic to keep the car running. The battery powered electric vehicle could be a lot more simple. And in fact, there was a great coordination between Thomas Edison, who I mentioned earlier, and Henry Ford, and the battery powered, the electric powered Model T that would be uh, released around 1914. And I think if you were betting, that could have been a pivotal shift to follow for a society that would arrange itself differently, lay itself out differently. And it's really World War I and the immediacy of the needs. And we can think about the tank in our heads, but the immediacy of the needs to fight and to win against an enemy that proves absolutely pivotal to the internal combustion engine. And after World War I, we'll never look back, and we begin to see the American society, maybe more than any other, integrate uh, petroleum into everything we do, and especially into transportation.
So you could almost say if there isn't an assassination in 1914 in Sarajevo that causes World War One, we might have had a different energy future.
I think so. And in my classes when I'm teaching about this idea, I always encourage how should students answer that question? Why do we drive gas-powered cars today? Why did we do it for the 20th century? And I think World War I is the most succinct answer. It's the most suitable answer. But it also could be unpacked in lots of ways too. But there's lots of technologies that emerge in World War I, and it's just fascinating to see how any young person at that time would have been involved, would have been pivotal in this. But somehow Eisenhower just becomes this character in the act, this drama of what I call the emergence of the high energy existence, where it's not like he owned oil wells and he believed this was really going to be great. He just kind of followed the obvious,
Yeah.
and that was very obvious to most people that this was the way society would go with just a little bit of prodding, just a little bit of push. And so he was in the right place to give those pushes at the right times.
Your book does so much. It shows us the energy alternatives of that moment. It shows us a younger Eisenhower than we're used to seeing, in a very interesting moment of his life, and doing something that we're Americans. We love to go on the road and experience travel. And I have a question from a listener. How was the route determined? It must have, I mean, it's a military trip, so they must have planned it very precisely, but were they trying to hit centers of the automotive industry? Were they trying to please members of Congress? How did they choose the route?
Well, and I think that was one of the lovely discoveries for me because, I knew that boosterism had been a big part of all sorts of things during this time period as basically Americans learned how to be consumers. But in this case, it took me back to my years. I was a PhD student at the University of Kansas, spent some time in the Midwest, and it really reminds me of that unique society that we know in the Midwest, where there's a constant effort to pull people off the highway, to make them stop as they go flying through. And that's what I see in this case. And this was that moment. And how did you ask that originally? What was the
Well, just wondering how they set the route. Like what were
Thank
they?
you. That's
Yeah.
the anchor I wanted to come back to. And so every community wanted to have it visit them. They wanted to have a celebration. They wanted to see the devices and celebrate the soldiers. But but it's these boosters who are um, to some degree, they're out for business. They're out for their own gain ultimately, but they're also committed to their communities getting the common good of a good road, of those kind of things we take for granted today. And so they would um, uh, essentially uh, set up the route following the inspiration of the other thing going on at this time is the Lincoln Highway development. The idea that if we were going to have a great nation, we should have a great highway. Again, before the interstate system. And so the Lincoln Highway Association was full of boosters, and they wanted this to follow the route that the Lincoln Highway was planned for. And that's almost completely what it did. But as you move out to the new territories out west, there was just aspirational passage. There was just aspirational places where the roads might be. And so it was very competitive. And I write about a couple situations, for instance, in Utah, where communities competed against each other to get not only the convoy to stop, but eventually to have the Lincoln Highway planned to come through there because it was thought it would have tourist attraction and tourist dollars. And that's where we see, in addition, the idea of roadways as economic corridors, as the new marketplace that was taking shape during this time. And of course, that is a small leap then to suburbanization, to the idea that we're not living in urban areas, we're connecting the roads, we're creating sprawl, and that is our world. And that takes shape from this event, from this moment, and Eisenhower's essential to it.
You think about dependence on gas and what suburbs mean to America and still mean. This is a seminal moment in the 20th century, in the American century. This is
It
defined
is.
the American century.
Absolutely. And I think it's not stretching it too much to say it wouldn't have happened without any of these cogs, these portions of the story, these connecting links. They all had to fall into place. And so I really do think that Eisenhower's experience with the automobile is kind of a Forrest Gump
Yeah, that's great.
situation where
Yeah.
he's just seizing and amplifying something that he observes going on, and others, Henry Ford, others, deserve credit for specific inventions and ideas. But it is all about connecting that, and that's what we do with the automobile.
Kind of a funny question coming in. Eisenhower's going off for a long time with his buddies. Was Mamie on board with this long trip?
I I love the experience that Ike and Mamie had throughout this because you get the taste of a young military couple, and we do need to factor in the fact that Mamie's family, which was named Dowd, Dowd, was very affluent and based in Denver and in Texas as well, and so she wasn't an ordinary figure. But Dwight was just a member of the military. To answer your question, she's very much involved in the Camp Cold experience. And in that chapter of the book, we talk about the birth of their first child and all that. But then part of the military experience, especially at that time, was to leave your spouse for long periods of time. And so they were apart 6 months, 8 months. And she visited with her father twice on the trip. And because the father was important, that was a big event, and everybody figured out that Dwight was important by association. But it's hard for us when we look at those pictures of him at that time to imagine that's not the president. That's not the military hero of World War II. That's just a young guy trying to figure out where to go. And that's what we see in this story.
Speaking of figuring out where to go, were there any moments it just seemed like they might not even make it? Like they'd break down in the mud, or the roads couldn't carry the heavy vehicles, or I mean, it seems so easy to us. You just get in a car and drive as long as you want. That's America. But it wasn't that way in 1919.
Exactly. And so to see this as a demonstration of the poor roads was a big part of it. And even though it was a great celebration, all the coverage in the local newspapers talked about how bad the experience was, talked about how many vehicles had broken down, been towed. Ultimately, when they get out to the territories, out to the farther west, yes, they did have to lose some vehicles, and they just pushed through to get to San Francisco, and got them later. But that was, I think, just part of learning what this was going to mean moving forward in terms of a cutting edge technology.
So, Brian, a question is just coming in. Can you talk about Ike's connection to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? Such an important town in our history with the Civil War, but also where he had his farm as president. And it's important in Ike's road trip in 1919.
Well, and that was part of what I loved as somebody for whom Gettysburg meant a great deal. I loved learning about it the way Ike did, because he didn't know Gettysburg. He grew up in, Texas and Kansas. And so the first trip he ever made to Gettysburg was as a training soldier. And that's how the battlefield worked initially, because it was one of the first preserved sites, meaning it was made into a park. But without getting into a whole different side story, it's just our definition of what a park meant has changed a great deal over the years. But at that time, it just meant we're not going to do anything specific here. We're going to set it aside. And one of those things was train soldiers. So, part of his training was to go and learn why Robert E. Lee did this, and why these other leaders made the decisions they made on the Gettysburg battlefield. And so ultimately, it did come to mean something to him. And when he and Mamie, as young people, came back and spent the year at Camp Colt, not only was it an important experience for them, uh, but that is, one of the other things I go into in Ike's road trip is in 1919, because of the war, influenza and the pandemic comes and really affects Gettysburg through Camp Colt, meaning the soldiers uh, there infected others. And so that became something else that was very formative for Eisenhower as he bonded with the community and made that situation work out okay. And so ultimately, then, when he reached the time when he and Mamie were going to think about retirement and living wherever they wanted to live, I'm sure access to Washington had something to do with it, but they bought the farm that is now a National Historic Site, and that is where he retired to, and played a lot of golf and did a lot of other things. But I think the battlefield meant a great deal to him.
So, as he goes on to the periods of his career that we know the best, as commander in chief in Europe and then as president, how do memories of 1919 shape his decisions as a commander in Europe and then as president? And with the highway system coming in, the Highway Act of 1956, is there any evidence he's still remembering Ike's road trip?
Yes, and you could always assume it had happened, but he left a written record. And so these dots connect. And that first quote I had, it's from the book, but on the first slide that I was showing you, yes, the idea of good roads came from this experience because he saw that we didn't have them, and he saw that how awfully bad the experience could be of not having the necessary infrastructure. And then once, the way I'd connect the dots, the way I argue in Ike's Road Trip, they connect, is that he saw what we didn't have. And then when he spent time in Europe, particularly in Germany, in the modern road system that was being constructed there, he saw the potential. And that's what he wanted for the United States. And so it all connects. And he just happens to be in the Oval Office and able to have an issue. And certainly the Truman administration, others had talked about the idea of infrastructure, but it was Eisenhower who could really use his political clout to make it happen.
And was the Pentagon involved as we start to build the huge highways of the 1950s? There's an element of thinking, isn't there, that this is part of our military readiness if there's going to
And
be.
that's what I was suggesting earlier when I mentioned the time period of the Cold War. You know, would Americans have tolerated the investment that was required just on its face for economic development? Maybe. But the argument, the way it was made during the Cold War in the mid 1950s, was just as you're suggesting. We need to be able to be prepared. In this case, the interstate highway system was about atomic attack and exiting in the most orderly fashion urban areas. And so the entire design, the entire rationale for the massive expenditure that Congress approved was to keep Americans safe if the Soviet Union attacked us with atomic detonations in our cities, that we would be able to evacuate the cities using this road system that doubled as the interstate highway.
Sobering fact that I will remember on my next. So do you think, I mean, a lot of your book, it's so interesting about the specific moment of 1919, but it's also about what is an energy transition? How do you handle it well? And are we in one now, do you think?
Well, yes, I'll answer it flatly. We are certainly in an energy transition, but, and that's where the sentence keeps going. And people like me who study energy transitions, I guess we should be a little happy that they're so dynamic. You can't predict how it's going to go, and they can change with a number of different factors, whether it be foreign relations or whether it be who's in the White House. These can affect an energy transition, but I would argue they can't stop it. So they can affect the rate that it happens at. I think that's one of the things we learn from looking into the past energy transitions, is that once it's really started and a society has identified where it's going and how, it's going to go. It can be affected, it can be influenced. And what I choose to really focus on is leadership, and a leader like Eisenhower who sees that pattern emerging and seeks to support the change, seeks to use his office and his time in office to assist in that shift, in that transition that seems to be inevitably happening. And in our case, we are shifting from fossil fuels. We have all different kinds of rationale for why that should happen, but the rate at which it happens is very much in flux. It's very much up to politics, up to foreign relations, as I said, and supply. And so those are the kind of things that I think are fascinating to watch as we are in an energy transition that somebody will write about someday, the way that I tried to write about the one in 1919.
I see Margaret.
I see her too.
Indeed. You all have provided just amazing insight into how our nation is powered and sort of the backstory of that, the Eisenhower years and his legacy. Thank you for sharing your research and conclusions. And now, as we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration Author Series, we've asked Brian to read just a brief paragraph from his book. So over to you, Brian, for that. And Ted, thank you for your wisdom.
Thank you, Margaret. Ted, thank you so much. That was
Thank you,
really
Brian.
helpful
It's
and
such a pleasure to talk to you.
lovely to spend time with you. Thanks, everybody. This is what we'll finish up with. And so I'm reading from page 160, if anybody happens to have one, right in the middle of the page. For some, great changes begin with seemingly insignificant choices. Ike's personal choices began with a willingness to venture from the Kansas prairie and into the military. Each decision that followed, including joining the convoy, was informed by his experience and his view of the changing modern world that surrounded him. Behind each decision, too, was a confidence that Americans would step into the breach. Eventually, Ike would become a key player in America's massive energy transition. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brian, for reintroducing us to Ike, the innovator, the truth teller, the decision maker, the prescient man who really made the best of every challenge and opportunity and changed our energy sources and uses in the past. You've painted a great portrait of him and energy in our country. A reminder to our audience, those of you who ordered a copy of Ike's Road Trip bundled with your event ticket, your signed books will be sent out in the days ahead, out the door by July 18. If you've not yet ordered a book or you'd like additional signed copies, you can purchase them directly from our partners at Porter Square Books. This is a truly delightful book. It's wonderful summertime history reading, a mix of really interesting topics and an incredible story about someone we all admire, General and President Eisenhower. It's Americana Eisenhower style, so I recommend it. Please order using the link being shared in the chat, and the bookstore can send your copies anywhere in the United States for yourself or as a gift, your signed copy. We simply need you to place your order by tomorrow, 5 p.m. Winding down our evening, I want to say that we at American Ancestors are really delighted to have presented tonight's highly original book talk. If you're researching a time, a person, or a family, my colleagues are here to help. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists. You'll see on screen some of the many educational programs hosted by our Brew Family Learning Center. My colleagues are hard at work providing skills and inspiration for family historians. Our mission in all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect. And for you literary sorts, we hope you'll return for more author talks on July 22 in a virtual program. We're presenting Fatherhood, the History of Love and Power by Augustine Sedgwick. This remarkable study of fathers and family culture documents the history of fatherhood back to the ancient world. With moderator Michelle Filgate, our author will bring to life Norman Rockwell images and academic studies alike, fathers Thomas Jefferson, Charles Darwin, and Bob Dylan, too. So don't miss this unique family history. On July 28, join us in person at the Boston Public Library, or if you're out of town, join us online for a discussion of the Gilded Age, especially the lives of architect Stanford White and sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. The award-winning historian Henry Winsick will take the stage to present his new book, Stan and Gus. Then our wonderful and wise curator, my colleague Kurt DiCamillo, will join him in a conversation. And then on August 13th, we'll venture back to the 17th century to the passions and perplexities revealed in the first ever personal advice column. Don't miss hearing from the prize-winning historian Mary Beth Norton about her book, I Humbly Beseech Your Speedy Answer, which was reviewed in last week's New Yorker magazine. So back to tonight, our great thanks to this evening's guests, Brian C. Black and Ted Widmore, and to tech producer Kathleen McKenzie. Thank you for your care and wisdom. And also to all of our audience, we appreciate appreciate and applaud your interest in America's history. Thank you, and we hope to see you again. A good night to all, especially you, Brian. Enjoy your time on the Cape, and thank you for Zooming in with us. Take care.
Pleasure.